My name is Simon Johnston. I'm one of the co-directors of the Shaping the Future of Work project. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the chair of our last session, who is Liz Reynolds, who's standing right here. Liz has been a force at MIT and in the broader world for studying future of work and the work of the future for a long time. She was previously the head of the Industrial Performance Center at MIT. She was a co-director of the Work of the Future project and high-profile publication on those issues. And she served in 2021, 2022 in the White House as special assistant to the president for manufacturing and other issues related to work of the future. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Liz Reynolds.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. And it's really a delight to be part of this next initiative. As Simon said, I had the privilege of being part of the task force on the work of the future, which I consider a precursor to this effort, and co-led with David Otter and David Mindell. And I would say, I think about looking back 5 years when we started that in 2018, and the zeitgeist at the time for the country was, the robots are coming, they're taking everybody's job, we're gonna have mass unemployment, and we're just at the mercy of this technological change. And I think about where we are today, just 5 years down the road. In fact, the robots have not come, and if we had had a few more robots during the pandemic, we might have been better off. Continue to have issues, quantity of jobs is not our issue with under 4% unemployment. It continues to be quality of jobs, particularly for low income and low educated workers. And I think as the last panel sort of indicated, the sense that we are really at the mercy of technology is shifted, that sense that we actually have control, we can, or have some element of control, some ability to shape technology, and AI as now the latest concern and threat is very hopeful in my mind. There's really a shift again in the discourse and in the conversation we're having, and even as we see in Washington. So our next panel is really going to take us home, I think, and talk about the issues that have been with us forever, which is really what type of work do we want in the future? In the end, this is really what this is all about. So let me introduce my panel, and please help me welcome them to the stage. We have Karen Kimbrough, Chief Economist from LinkedIn. Nick Romeo, who's a writer at The New Yorker, as well as on the faculty of the School of Journalism at Berkeley. And Zeynep, professor of the practice at the Sloan School, as well as the founder of the Good Jobs Institute. So please come to the phone. Thank you. So why don't we begin maybe just with a few opening remarks. People can understand kind of where you're all coming from on this topic. And Karen, I'll have you begin if you don't mind.
Not at all. Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. As you know, I'm chief economist at LinkedIn, and just for context, this is probably one of those media platforms that was just discussed in the last session. I feel like needs for caveats. But our mission is to kind of connect every member of the global workforce with opportunity. So I come here in that spirit. And I think what I wanted to do was just share a little bit about the work that we've been doing. Our data spans 1 billion members worldwide. There are 65 million companies on the platform that post jobs, so we can see what skills are being sought by hirers. We can see what job seekers are doing. And of course, I look at this all in an anonymized, aggregated, very large data set. And it gives us a chance to do a better mapping of people's career paths. So one of the things that we've been focused on is trying to understand what might be early indications of how generative AI, so I'm really thinking about generative AI right here, might be starting to show up in the workplace. And I know it's early days. And so I thought what I'd just share really quickly, maybe a couple of takeaways that we're seeing. Well, one is that we're seeing skills change at an amazing rate. So the same job 8 years ago looked for about 25% different skills than it does now. Most of the skill rotation is in the technological space. And that's on average across all occupations. There's a big range depending on the country and the occupation and the sector. So one is the skill change, very, very rapid. And I think generative AI is accelerating that. The other observation that we're seeing is really in terms of, what we did was we mapped all the occupations that we could. We have this taxonomy of 41,000 skills. And we said, well, which of if I take any occupation, and I consider that a set of tasks that require skills, which occupations have a high proportion of skill required that generative AI can do, and which really people can do, at least for right now. We know that's changing quickly. And what we found is there are jobs that are likely to be disrupted, the librarian, the legal officer, the financial officer, and then there are jobs that are likely to be insulated from AI, at least, or generative AI, at least initially, so locksmith, veterinarian, physical trainer, dancer. And then there are jobs that are likely to be augmented because they have a high proportion of skills that, yes, can be replicated by generative AI, but also a high proportion of skills that cannot. And so those are often, frankly, in the tech space, and that might be a function of what we see. But by and large, what we're seeing is there are different speeds of displacement, different speeds of augmentation happening, but it is happening across all sectors. And so what that tells me is that the adoption rate of this technology is not a flash in the pan, which I sometimes have to tell people. I'm like, actually, AI's been here for a long time. And then also generative AI is not a flash in the pan. It is here. It is changing what employers are looking for. We also see that members are adding skills. So there's been it sounds crazy, but it's true, a 75% month-on-month increase of members adding AI skills. This is from a very low base. And our threshold for what we call an AI skill is there's about 121 of them, and out of 41,000. And so we have members adding skills very rapidly. We have seen job postings in the English language increase, I think it's 21 times since November of 2022. So in the past year, we've seen a 21 times increase in job postings in the English language looking for ChatGPT-related skills, whether it's large language model, trainer, prompt engineer, and all those sorts of things. So long story short, and I'll wrap up here, what we're seeing is an acceleration in the rotation of skills that are required for certain roles. We're seeing an adoption that I wouldn't call widespread, but it's kind of pervasive across all industries. So very fast-growing adopters are financial markets, retail, professional services, think like the big accounting firms. But we also see it in manufacturing, of course, and customer service and tech. And so it's in every single sector. It is definitely faster in India and Israel and Finland and Singapore than it is here in the US. So we can look across countries. And what I will close on just as a high point is maybe to say that I think what we found looking at our data just last spring is probably already somewhat outdated. And we're going to refresh this again and see what happens going forward.
Great, thank you. Nick?
Yeah, thank you so much. Pleasure to be here. So I wanted to touch on 3 ideas, each of which is sort of a chapter in a new book that I have out. The book, I was kind of pleased, I guess, to hear people using this word over and over this afternoon, the alternative. This was the title of the book. I feel like there's something in the zeitgeist there. Also, maybe a bit of a deep cut. It's an allusion to the phrase associated with Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, there is no alternative. So very much in the spirit of the conference and the kind of countering of economic fatalism. So the 3 ideas I wanted to touch on, the first is living wages. So I have a chapter in which I kind of argue for an expansion of the concept of living, which is a sort of inherently normative, moral, political question. What do we mean by that? I kind of champion this vision of that, which dates back to Theodore Roosevelt, Samuel Gompers, John A. Ryan, a Catholic priest who coined the phrase. So to get a little more granular, I think a lot of people, if you hear the phrase living, you think, oh, this means things like having some time for a vacation, being able to eat in a restaurant, maybe saving a little for a rainy day, having something to save for retirement, for childcare. Most people would think living includes that. In fact, most of the businesses saying that they pay living wages in America pay far, far less than a standard that would enable all of those elements I just mentioned. So if we think about a hypothetical world in which living wages were kind of worthy of the name, a natural concern, which, even if you take on board the research of folks like Card and Kruger, who won a Nobel Prize for showing that concerns about unemployment are maybe overstated, even so, if people were making, say, $50 an hour in coastal cities, maybe unemployment would be an issue. So this brings me to the second thing, which is another chapter in the book, and that's the idea of a job guarantee. So if you think about a labor market and your only concern is whether or not this could affect how much private sector folks maybe struggle to attract employees, perhaps a job guarantee is not as attractive. If you sort of have a vision of economics that includes things like the psychological welfare of people who are long-term unemployed, it becomes much, much more compelling. I talk about a case study outside of Vienna, Austria, where people who are eligible for a job guarantee, they are given the option not to participate, and yet all of them wanted to. So there's something very interesting about that. A lot of people I spoke with talk about the importance of time structure, of meaning, of community. It's also worth mentioning that they participate in designing the work they do. So they don't sort of just have to take any job. There's some effort to meet local needs, but there's also some effort to sort of meet folks where they are and give them jobs that they find meaningful. Okay, so let's now advance the hypothetical to a world in which we have both genuine living wages and a job guarantee at a federal level. Would this actually touch wealth inequality? There were some papers this morning on income inequality. Wealth inequality is different, especially with the S&P 500 at very, I think, historically high levels. You might wonder whether just through wage increases and guaranteed employment alone, folks at the bottom part of the economic distribution would ever be able to, say, afford enough to buy a home in America, pay for college at a place like MIT, et cetera. I know there's generous aid, but sort of, hopefully you take my point. So the third point I'd like to touch on is just worker ownership, in which workers have some equity in the businesses where they work. There are multiple models for this. Famous one in Spain is the Mondragon network of cooperatives. In America, the real kind of workhorse are ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans. I'll try to squeeze in two quick statistics. One is that, if the same level of ownership that existed at Sears stores in the 1950s in America, if that existed at Amazon I think it was in 2018, all Amazon workers would have had about $400,000 in equity. So this would be pretty substantial. This would go a decent way towards creating a middle class. In general, also, people with ESOPs, especially in lower and middle wage and skill jobs, have much, much higher retirement accounts when they are ready to leave the workforce. So these are my sort of three hypotheticals that have a certain logical linkage between them. I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you. Zeynep.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. My field is operations, and the work that I do focuses on what we might call unglamorous work. That takes place in retail stores, restaurants, shelving merchandise, baking bread, serving food, and that work is so important for the functioning of our economy that during the pandemic we call the workers who do that work essential workers. And the main message that I want to communicate today is if we value that work and respect that work for the essential work that it is, then we could create what you were talking in the beginning, Darren, about a strong democracy and a strong middle class. And the upside could also be large for companies. But the status quo right now for that work is low productivity, low quality, low pay, nowhere near living wages, and lack of dignity. If you look at the worker side, so many people can do the repetitive manual work that requires social interaction, right? And so many companies treat labor as just an input, any other input, and they use the law of supply and demand when they set pay. So the market pay, right? If you use the market pay is unlivable pay. And this is not just for part-timers, for full-timers. And what happens is a lot of full-timers have, as Liz Schuler talked about, 2, 3 jobs. They can't sleep because their schedules are changing all the time. And you know, low pay affects their mental health, their cognitive health, their physical health. The list goes on. And they are stuck in a vicious cycle of poverty because they don't perform well at work. And what I found out, though, in my early research in retail stores is that companies, too, operate in a vicious cycle because low pay and high turnover, employee turnover, go hand in hand. And employee turnover alone costs a lot of money. You know, though most companies we work with have never quantified the cost. But what ends up happening when a company has high employee turnover is that there are lots of mistakes. There are lots of productivity issues. There are customer service issues. And then the company's sales and profits decline. And under performance pressure, companies can't invest in their workers. And then what do? They design the work for the lowest common denominator. And this is why workers are not involved in technology. This is not why workers are not involved in improvement, because there's chaos in these environments. And the frontline managers are constantly fighting fires, and they're this close to having anxiety problems. So that's the status quo, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's an alternative, and that alternative doesn't require higher prices or lower profits for companies. And I first saw that alternative in Spain. So this is something that connects our work. Spain's largest supermarket chain, and then a Tulsa-based convenience store chain, and then Costco and Trader Joe's, multiple companies that have low prices for their customers. How do they do it? So if you look at Costco, the average Costco worker in 2022 made $26 an hour. That's almost $10 an hour more than the typical retail worker. At Quick Trip, if you started as a full-timer last year, you would make more than $50,000 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Right? But the thing is, these companies don't just pay more. They design the work to make each hour of labor worth more, because they design the job for high productivity. And that high productivity is what enables higher pay. And the way that they design the job also enables people to do a good job, to involve in improvements, in processes and products, and shine in front of the customer, which of course not only improves performance, but makes the job a better job and keeps turnover low. And in these environments, you know, people have careers, not just jobs. And so, you know, one reaction that you may have as you hear me, you know, yes, we've seen this before, high road practices. Like I can see some people rolling their eyes and saying, you know, Costco maybe is an exception because they have wealthy customers and it's a warehouse model. Quick Trip is in Tulsa. Maybe they have great locations. Mercadona is, I don't know, in Spain. If this was really good, we will see wider adoption. But when I wrote my first book in 2014, I had a lot of business leaders who came and said, you know what, that vicious cycle that you described, we are in that vicious cycle. We want to get out. But how do we get out? We don't know how to get out because there are so many interrelated things that need to change. And to be able to help them change, I founded the nonprofit Good Jobs Institute, where I have the pleasure of working with my former MIT Sloan students. And now we have created evidence from, you know, a $60 billion retailer with 100,000 workers to a small restaurant with 2 locations and just a couple dozen workers that change is possible, it is profitable, and it is very much worth the effort. And if more companies changed, then we could create a much stronger middle class and have people who have hope versus despair.
That's a very optimistic and encouraging view. I appreciate that. Maybe we should ground ourselves in truth here with Karen to say, you described a little bit, you know, how jobs are changing, and it seems to be AI and, you know, adding skills. Does that speak, though, just to a certain segmentation of the economy? Is it just the higher educated worker? We heard this morning from some of the research about the value of AI to improving productivity for the low-skilled worker. Can you describe a little bit more how is this playing out across the economy?
Sure. So I'll describe what we see in our data. So just with the, you know, full disclosure, of course, there are other groups that look at labor market data and might catch a different cohort. But what I will say is We definitely see that the distributional impacts of generative AI are not equally experienced. So just looking at the current data set. So for example, we do think women are overrepresented in the jobs that are more at risk for disruption. And we see we also see that young people are more overrepresented in the skills that GAI can do, but I really think that's just like a head fake, and that ultimately young folks are so much more digitally native and adept that they're gonna be just fine. One of the things that we did was we looked at the jobs that were most likely to have a high proportion of GAI replicable skills. And we looked at where those members lived just for the US, so this is only the 230 million, well, not all 230 million members, but of the US set, that's what we have. And we asked, what's the median income in the communities that they live in, where these people are in jobs that are most likely to be disrupted? And it wasn't the median income, it was 10% above the median. These were folks that were not the locksmith, but it was the librarian. So this is sort of your solidly middle class that looked to be the most exposed. This is for the US data set. And of course, this is a snapshot in time. One of the other things that we saw, we didn't do self-ID we didn't look at race, but we did look at generations. And of course, you can imagine that millennials and Gen Z were a little bit better prepared for generative AI than the boomers and Gen X. Hello.
That means with their skill sets that they
have.
Match, right.
But of course, the occupation you're in also matters. So if you're more senior, you don't need to go off and figure it out necessarily. But what I would say is I think distributional effects are incredibly important. And it's something that right now we see it really does matter what field you're in, what occupation you're in. And I do worry a little bit about we're not super good at upskilling folks and providing training, and this is an opportunity where I always say, you don't have to be an AI expert, you just have to know how to be AI literate, how to use the software in your domain that's gonna help you be a little bit more efficient. And so it's not about all of us becoming coders, it's about all of us just getting a little bit more literate in our space. And a good example of this is, I don't think administrative assistants are going to go away. Their occupation is ripe for disruption, but I think what's going to happen is they're going to rotate towards the intuitive human skills, the skills that I don't think generative AI is going to be fully replicating. So generative AI will help you with your time management, but it will not help you figure out how necessarily you want to prioritize different important meetings and make ethical trade-offs and things like that. I think that's a while away.
And did you say that you see adoption across the board, across every industry? There's no laggards. Is there really a sense that everyone's all in?
There's definitely laggards. And so I tend to look at the labor market in terms of industry because I find that is more helpful for how I think about it. But if you think about it in terms of occupations, there's a lot of hiring for AI and generative AI in the IT functions. It's not happening in functions that do strategy, right? So when I see there's all industries are hiring AI, they're all hiring it in IT. They're not hiring it to really radically change their business processes. And so I think there's early days yet. We don't yet know. This is like a technology in search of an application that's useful, and every single industry is going to use it, or apply it differently. So I don't think we're there yet. So yes, in all industries, but not in all occupations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very helpful. Okay, let me turn back to Nick. I actually had a copy of Nick's book, and I've left it someplace in this room. I wanted to hold it up. So if you see the book, please hold it up at this moment in time. I think it's sitting on a chair or something. But in any case, there it is. Have we got the book? Yes, thank you. There's the book. All right, the alternative. But so I don't know if many of the economists know this, but Nick sort of comes out of a philosophy tradition, and sees economics as sort of part of a philosophical tradition and maybe a political tradition. And there's this quote that you have in something drawn from the book that says, "It's possible to marry economics and morality." looking at Mr. Otter, by adopting economic models and policies that give tangible reality to the otherwise empty platitude that a better world is possible. Can you kind of take us back for a moment and set the stage for how you've thought about economics and your vision for the alternative?
Yeah, thank you so much, and I appreciate the
Yes, there it is.
the visual. So this insight is hardly original to me. I quote John Maynard Keynes. Many other economists, I think, share the view broadly that political economy is a kind of more capacious but also more accurate framing for the work of economics, which inevitably has a lot of normative questions about distribution, ethical and political questions, like we've been hearing on many panels this afternoon about consequences and implications of different policies and models. So it's striking maybe just as an index of the sort of current culture, if this does present as a radical framing, I think that's itself kind of interesting. I guess I would see it as just sort of mainstream point that economics is maybe a branch of political philosophy that is highly elaborated in its mathematical and technical formulations, but that is never really able to be detached from previous questions about value and meaning. I mean, people on earlier panels were using phrases about human flourishing. You know, Aristotle would approve of this. To be a little more specific, I mean, one thing that I think touches on a few of the ideas that have been raised, it will require a jump over to Spain, which hopefully is okay, but you know, the network of cooperatives in Mondragon, I spent some time there, have a chapter on that. They've been widely studied as well, but there is a kind of perhaps strange lack of familiarity with this model in the States sometimes. So a few key features. One is that executive to worker pay is capped at 6-to-1. So, I mean, take your favorite examples in America, whether that's Jamie Dimon or any other CEO, and just do the math, imagine what their lowest paid worker is, and then multiply by 6. We'd have a very different society. And so if you spend some time up in northern Spain, I mean, it's interesting to watch senior vice presidents of major companies just kind of hang out with people who work on a factory floor. The Mondragon co-ops, another sort of interesting feature is that they're almost content neutral. You can pour a lot of different businesses into the model. So they do very technical industrial manufacturing, jet engines, elevators, buses. They also have a grocery store chain. They have schools. They run banks. So you can put a lot of different types of economic activity into the model. But again, the two kind of distinguishing features, I've only touched on one. That's the 6-to-1 pay cap. The other is one worker, one vote. So people sometimes talk about economic democracy. They talk about worker voice. I think this is a really powerful kind of way to institutionalize it. And you know, some of the decisions that workers are voting on are quite consequential. They're things like strategic acquisition. Should we buy this competitor? There are also things, you know, during the pandemic, like should we shut down and get a little bit less money now, but have a little bit more job security? It's, you know, if you have a sort of procedural commitment to democracy as a good in itself, I think this is a very compelling model. Even if you don't have any kind of procedural or principled commitment to democracy, you can still make a more kind of conventional, I don't mean to sound too disdainful, but a more conventional kind of MBA style case about like, it's the smart thing, the incentives align, et cetera. You know, I think there's something to that. There's some research to support that. I think there's also like a place, and this gets back to the political economy framing of these topics, for just saying like, no, there's something just inherently good about voice and participation of workers, kind of independent of those other consequences.
Right. That's certainly been a theme today and obviously in the last few years about what does you know, work need to look like and how does it change. And Zeynep, I want to get back to you because you said exactly what I was going to ask, which is, aren't the companies you're working with exceptions? Like somehow you've found, you know, those that are willing to lean in on this, but like how realistic is it that we could get adoption at a large scale, the kind of what you've seen at these companies in the service sector to really make the kind of impact that we want to have?
Look, I think you could ask the question, what would it take to get large-scale adoption of good management practices? Because from outside, we look at companies and we think that they are big profit maximization machines. But that's not the case, perhaps. I mean, I love the work of Raffaella Sadun, Nick Bloom, and John Van Reenen, and they show that, very good management practices that have been around for a long time. Most of the companies, more than 12,000 business units they've looked at, 6% of them implement those. And I don't think that if we leave it up to business leaders alone, we can solve, we can get to this good jobs, strong middle class. But I don't think that we can do it without them either. And they can do it. And maybe I can take you inside a company and see what happens, like what it would take for them to be able to adapt the system so that we can have some empathy for these leaders too. Because I think from outside, things may look different. So when we work with companies, and now our Good Jobs Institute work with over 30 companies, we did workshops with the largest employer in the United States to small ones. And we teach them about the good job strategy, and it is about heavy investment in people, not just pay, but also schedules, career paths, et cetera, and operational choices that improve productivity and contribution. And when we teach this, and we ask the companies to identify what they would need to change inside, the list is really long. Because if you look at the work that employees do, right? Let's take retail, because retail is so easy for us to relate to. If you look at the work that retail employees do, that work is affected by strategy, by digital, by merchandising, by logistics. So those functions have to be part of this. And many of the changes that they need to make are interdependent changes, so you can't just make one change and expect results. And some of the changes require investment, like investment in pay. And then if we think, so this is neither easy nor fast. And if you look at CEOs, it's easy to mock them. I think to say, they don't want to create great jobs, but think about them, right? They have shrinking tenures. A typical CEO is in that position for like 5 years in the United States now. They are under tremendous pressure, performance pressure. They have competition. Nobody is asking them to invest in people, but they are asking them, how about that technology investment? So we have this system set up, and even in this system, we have seen companies to change. But what it took to change was at a high level. One is competitive urgency. These leaders were convinced that unless they change, they won't be able to create value for their customers, and they won't be able to grow and sustain their business. And that competitive urgency is what got them there. And I can get into more details in terms of what it took, but I think it is possible. We can't do it with business leaders alone, but we can't do it without them either, because we need to show that this is possible, this is profitable, and they need to be role models.
And specifically with the companies you're working with, what are some of the, the top changes they make or the innovations they engage in that have a sort of direct impact on workers?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you pay as an example, and I'll give you why pay is very difficult to do, and so many, and why it takes so much courage from business leaders. And I wish we didn't rely on so much courage for them to make big scale change. So one specific example: John Furner becomes the CEO of Sam's Club, which is Costco's competitor. They don't have locations in wealthy places, so it's different. And he's very intrigued about the good job strategy. We did a workshop with them, and they had to change 79 different things, but one of them was pay. And they need to simplify the work. They use clever use of technology to improve They didn't use technology to substitute. They used technology to improve productivity of employees and improve customer value. But one of the changes was investing in people, in pay. And the first set of pay raises were going to be $5 to $7 an hour, from a basis of $15 an hour. This is a big pay investment. This is something that could change whether somebody has a single job, full-time job, or multiple jobs. When he wanted to make this change, HR came and said, don't raise pay. Last time we raised pay, it didn't reduce turnover. Finance said it's not in the budget because large companies operate in silos. And they are used to, by our very smart MBA students, perhaps, I don't know, but they are used to doing an ROI analysis of each change in isolation. But John knew that pay alone wasn't what they were going to do, because he asked the question, can I create value for my customers if I don't have a great team? No. Can I have a great team if I have high turnover? No. Can I reduce turnover if I don't pay more? No. I have to increase pay. What else do I need to do to make it work? Leaders have agency. They can change outcomes. They could change the work to make it more productive, and that's the type of change that it required. And one thing that was crucial was belief in people. Because I think so many leaders see their workers have attendance problems, they don't show up on time, they don't do a good job, and they think, how can we trust these people? Why would we raise their pay? And even those of us who are interested in job quality, our first inclination is, let's fix the people, let's upskill them, let's train them, versus fix the system that they operate in. But the reason I think leaders like John could make this change was because they had the shop floor focus, like you were talking about. They spent so much time in the front lines. Many of them worked in the front lines. So faith in people, I think, is super important if we want to make this type of change.
Can I just jump on real quick? I was going to say this is really resonating for me.
That was a really long answer.
At LinkedIn, so we don't really focus on pay at LinkedIn, but one of the things that we do see is like how long people stay in their jobs, and you can benchmark within an industry like 6 competitors and who has the worst attrition or the best attrition, however you want to define it. And so one of the things that we saw was companies that excel at internal mobility for their folks, which I think is sort of implicitly a proxy for giving them experiences and maybe giving them upskilling, they retain their employees for twice as long. So it's not that long. It ends up being like a little less than 6 years as opposed to about 3. But the point is that investing in people, and pay is super important. I mean, we all work for pay, I think, right? But so is the idea that you're going to be invested in. And increasingly, we see younger generations saying that's really important to them. They really, really want to feel that they have a career path and not just a job.
Career path is huge.
It's massive.
And once you commit to promoting from within, then your entire HR system changes, because now you're hiring differently.
Correct.
Now you're coaching people differently.
We see all of this.
It changes the whole thing. So yes, we can keep talking about career paths.
Well, I think this is kind of promising and exciting because it does provide this, real data and a path forward for a lot of companies. I wonder, Nick, have you seen innovative ideas that translate like this into some of the vision you have for the alternative? You mentioned living wage and job guarantee and worker ownership. Are there, places where you're seeing this play out, apart from in Spain and Mondragon, which we know well, where you think it's very encouraging and there's something for us to learn from that?
Yeah, so I do have examples in America. In terms of worker ownership, the largest thing, like I mentioned, in America is the ESOP movement. Something that is maybe a little bit less familiar, although increasingly more so, is a new model of business ownership in which a legal instrument, a purpose trust, becomes the owner of a company. The purpose is then specified according to usually the desires of the retiring founder. So I talked for the book to a bunch of folks, mostly at smaller businesses, although small is a relative term. And a few months after I had an article on this, it was heartening to see the retiring founder of Patagonia do the same thing, use a purpose trust. And the motivation is to kind of prevent short-termism. So if new owners acquire a business from a retiring founder, private equity comes to mind, but it could be any new owner. They may not share values having to do with pay, job quality, internal promotion, but also other values. I mean, they may not want to donate a certain percentage of profits to stewardship of the planet. They may eliminate profit-sharing plans, et cetera. So whatever the retiring founder cares about, if they want to kind of legally protect that, this model allows them to use a purpose trust to own the business. So it's a kind of clever legal engineering way to dethrone profit maximization, short-termism from the kind of animating motive of a lot of companies. So I found that encouraging. And happy to talk about more, but also don't want to go on too long.
Yeah, no, are there other concrete, but we're going to turn to questions from the audience in a minute, but other concrete steps folks would like to see taken? Obviously, we'd like to have more companies adopting what you're talking about, but what else comes to mind? Yeah,
I have one other hobby horse to hop on real quick, which is we're seeing increasingly hirers willing to focus on skills as opposed to prior titles that applicants had or degrees that they hold. And it's a slow moving thing, but I think the more we hire based on skills, first of all, it'll be a little bit more of a democratic process. And what we actually find in our own data is that when you take a skills-based approach, so what can you actually do, hopefully it's validated, you actually expand your potential talent pool, sometimes as much as 20 times. This is in our own data. In the US, I think it's about 10 times expansion. And the expansion is disproportionately in favor often of underrepresented groups, so women, people of color. So getting over that sort of initial barrier of did you go to a certain school, or did you get a certain degree, or did you have a certain title, makes a huge difference for hiring.
Yeah, and maybe not concrete steps, but I wish that we had a strategic vision for good jobs in America. And I'm very uncomfortable talking about this as an operations person, so this is not my area, and hopefully it will be useful. But as I look at companies that were able to change, they had a very clear problem to solve, and they created strategic vision around that problem, right? To be competitive, we have to win with our customers. To do that, we need good jobs. What if we created a problem and we aligned under that problem, and that problem was something around the lines of restoring a healthy middle class, right? What if the problem that we solve is not what are we going to do with AI, because it seems like we're trying to find an application, and it was how do we create a strong middle class and people who have hope instead of despair in this country. Then the next thing was, well, to be able to create that middle class, we need to transform the low-wage service jobs into good jobs, because that's where the jobs are. And these are perhaps less of the jobs, making a bed, changing the bedpans. These are jobs that are less likely to be affected by AI because it's manual physical work. And so the question is how, and this is where the future job growth, much of the future job growth is coming from in the service sector. And then the next one is, well, how do we make these jobs good jobs? The only way to do that is by designing them for higher productivity and contribution. That's the only way to be able to pay people more without increasing prices. No business leader that I've talked to want to do that, or reducing profits. Then perhaps we can all align behind, what are all the different players in the ecosystem, from unions to policy makers to government, to business schools, to business leaders. What do we need to do, and to consumers too, about what we value? What do we need to do to align behind high productivity, good paying jobs for the low wage workers? And I think it has to start with valuing and respecting that work. That is very unglamorous work.
Excellent. I love the idea of a strategic vision for good jobs in America. I like to think that the Biden administration has taken a step forward in trying to help provide that. But why don't we at this point open up for questions and also for comments on all of this? Any questions from the audience? Yes, Jerome.
So thank you for all of these very interesting thoughts. I completely agree with, I think, Nick and Zeynep, and I think Karen also, that there's an undersupply of good jobs, and we have an alternative where we have more high-paying jobs that also have higher productivity and are more meaningful. But I'm not as optimistic as you are that can be achieved by just business leaders deciding to do so. I think it's a much more systemic problem, and unless we sort of grapple with the systemic aspects of it with policy and broader changes, that may be hard. Let me just give sort of three dimensions of that very quickly. One is, in a paper a couple of years ago, Pascual Restrepo, Andrea Manera, and I estimated, what's the tax that a firm pays if they hire a worker versus what's the tax that they pay if they hire some computer equipment to do the same job, 30% versus 5%. So there's a big subsidy to firms to actually hire machines rather than workers, and that gets it's even worse when you invest in your workers via training. What are the technologies we provide to firms? We provide, especially with digital technologies, a huge slew of automation technologies, and we have underinvestments in human complementary technologies. So it's going to be much harder to create the good jobs that increase the productivity of low-wage workers. And for many companies, there are a lot of incentives to have cost cutting. So I think unless we deal with these, it's going to be much harder just trying to convince business leaders. I think the vision part is very important, but I don't think it's going to be enough.
Oh, I'm absolutely. And on the tech side, I mean, they can depreciate the technology investment. They cannot depreciate the people investment, right? There are all sorts of reasons for them to adapt technologies, and that's why they go to, if you see labor as just a cost to be minimized, you replace it, with social technologies that you talk about. But if you see people as the drivers of growth and success, then you say, okay, when I look at technology, how do I improve value for the customer? How do I increase productivity of people? But of course, company leaders alone are not going to achieve this. But if we align on, if on the worker side, on the union side, if we say, what do we need to do to promote high productivity, cross-training, involving improvement, like we have to be actively for these things because they raise productivity, and that's what enables higher pay, not just collective bargaining, then that vision, I think, can drive all the different actors towards similar goals.
I'll just respond. I understand exactly what your point is, and I would say, in our data, what we see are the fastest. I think we looked at the 25 fastest growing jobs just on our platform, again, just in our ecosystem, and like 7 or 8 out of the 10, so 80%, 70, 80% of them were ones that didn't particularly exist 20 years ago. So there is, I don't think I have to convince you of this, there is this sort of generation of new jobs. That's the yay side. And the nay side is there's an enormous skill gap. It's enormous. If I told you like the ratio of demand for AI skills relative to AI talent, AI talent's like 2%. Out of our 1 billion members, 2%. And we have a kind of a low bar for what we call AI talent. So 2%, it's nothing. And it's mostly men, by the way. And so I'll get off my happy horse, but I'm agreeing with you, like I do think there's some huge challenges that we have.
Right here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this panel. So I work here at Sloan with our MBAs as they're taking the next step in their career. And a lot of them go in to work in management consulting and banking and technology and more of the higher paid roles, not these roles that we're talking about. And these are also some of the industries that are largely responsible for gutting the middle class in the last 70 years. And at the same time, these MBAs have values of wanting to impact the world in a positive way and want to help make a better future. And so I'm curious, as you think about people sort of in that middle management, starting their careers sort of 5 to 10 years in, they're not at the executive level where they have the agency to drive the kind of change you might be talking about. I'm just curious what advice you have for them as they think about building a career, wanting to make a good wage, and at the same time wanting to have a positive impact on society.
Yeah, Nick.
Wow,
Yeah. Well, so I think to some extent this picks up on Duran's question as well. It might be worth pushing back a little on the sort of lionization of private sector heroes and solutions, which, I'm guilty of in the book, probably a lot of people are. There is something admirable when someone in the private sector swims upstream, or to mix metaphors, they're pushing back against these prevailing headwinds. It's natural to want to celebrate that, right? It's natural to want to say, look at this retiring founder. They walked away from $100 million. They still have 20 million, say, but they're actually leaving something on the table to do the right thing for employees. I think there's value in those case studies. But ultimately, I kind of agree with, I think, the implication of the previous question that we want policy, we want legislation, right? We want what's currently called a minimum wage should probably, like the living wage should become the minimum wage, right? And then you'd have a sort of arms race where there'd be like the real living wage. Right? This is already happening in the UK, for instance. They call a minimum wage a living wage, but then people in the nonprofit sector over there are like, well, that actually is just like you're dying slightly less quickly. You're not living. You're still horrifically impoverished. So they lobby for what they call the real living wage or the true living wage. And you can see the kind of linguistic arms race where then their critics, no, the true living wage, this is a virtuous arms race. We want that sort of thing, but we want a floor that's established at a policy level, right, rather than just the kind of private sector thing. I mean, another point I would make, which is not unique to me, but it's just kind of like the sort of, the conventional sort of framework of argument or justification tends to involve the exclusion of a lot of moral factors, but this is sort of foreign to both our empirical experience as humans, like we do care about other people, externalities of so-called business decisions, whether it's gutting the middle class, as you put it, or environmental externalities. They're not just like unpaid, right? They're just paid by other people, maybe in the future, maybe in another country, maybe by us quite soon. So I think sort of expanding that frame of reference so that the external is internal, both conceptually and also ideally in a price mechanism as well. Those are some thoughts, yeah.
Well, my one thought is so many of my students, every semester I have 170 MBA students in my 2 courses, and they take some of these jobs because the tuition is so high and they have a ton of money to pay. So, I mean, debt to pay. So I wish that we made our education more affordable so that they can go into world-changing jobs. But I'll give one nice anecdote about the power of our students too. I know these are just a few case studies, but minimum wage is $7.25. So I think like, I'll stop there. So one of my former students who was in our LGO program, this LGO program is a combination of engineering and management, and they have internships, students have internships. And the student who was in the Marines for 13 years, he served in Afghanistan, so big guy, 6'6", and Michael Ross is his name. After LGO program, he went to join a private equity firm. He worked in the front lines at a factory, turned around that factory, and then he sends me an email and he says, we exited, I made a ton of money, I want to share it with workers. What should I do? I said, Michael, don't share it with the workers, raise their pay, right? They didn't, this is not charity, raise their pay. Several months later, he left his private equity firm. He said the CEO would never go for it. And then he moved near Nashville, Tennessee, where his family was. And he took on a role at a pest control company because he wanted to apply the good job strategy as the VP of operations at this pest control company. Now, he gets paid less than what he was getting paid at his private equity firm, base pay, and then he's not getting a bonus. But within his first year, Michael brought everybody to a living wage, all the technicians to a living wage. He enabled them to have pride in their work. Their turnover is down. Customer retention is higher. So this is a type of, and he said, now I figured out, I lost my sense of purpose that I had in the Marines when I came to the business world, and now I have my sense of purpose. So I think if we create more examples like this and case studies and show our students, look, he came to my class and he shared this with his classmates and showed these potential paths where you don't have to be a CEO to make the change. You can go into these smaller, there are so many small to medium-sized businesses where our students can turn them around and make a big impact, and we need more of those.
Maybe there's another lesson in there about private equity. Are there any other, another question from the crowd? Yes.
Thanks for a great discussion. As you think about, and maybe there might be some data at LinkedIn on this, but as you think about companies that have been successful in their management practices to improve the conditions all around, can you think of any examples where those organizations have taken their management practices and actually brought it into how they go to market, what they are bringing to the marketplace in their, not just about their marketing and communications, but where there's evidence that the customers see that reality of change in their management practices?
I can start. So a real quick example is there was a point at which you saw certain companies back to skills-based hiring. They actually said, okay, let's start a program. Let's just invite people in for interviews, and you don't have to have finished college, and you're going to take a test, and if you pass the test, then you're eligible to go to the next round, just validate your skills. And we ended up, I think it was LinkedIn that did this, hiring about 25 or 30 people who otherwise would have never made it past, frankly, the front initial screening. And a lot of them, kind of got their leg, I'm not saying that private sector is going to save the world, by the way, but just got their leg into a private sector job that wouldn't have been accessible. So I do think there's elements of trying to break down a lot of the barriers to entry. The other one I would say, and again, is just I don't understand why, well, I do understand why, but a lot of companies come to us and they actually are like, how do we retrain our workers? Like what skill, they're asking me what skills they need. And I'm like, I don't know, you know what you're doing. What do I know? I'm an economist, like 6 opinions. So there's some gap between figuring out how to retrain people and then what skills do they need. And then universities are coming to me saying, what should our graduates learn in order that they're ready for the job market? There's like some lack of conversation happening. So I don't think I answered your question entirely, but one of my concerns is how do we fill in the gaps in the reskilling and upskilling process so there's more on-ramps into sustainable jobs?
Yeah, in terms of customer satisfaction and sales, customer service, these companies are outliers in their industry. So I give Quick Trip as an example. Quick Trip has such loyal customers. Their sales per hour, which is a productivity metric, but it's very much affected by the customer service that they have, is 50% higher, was 50% higher when I studied them at the time, than the top quartile in their industry. Why? Because the stores are always clean. Why? Because the checkout is fast. Why? Because the shelves are always stocked. And when I look at the companies that we work with that have transformed into this good jobs model, yes, they've raised their labor turnover go down, pay go up, turnover go down, productivity go up, but their customer satisfaction and loyalty moved up. Sam's Club, their NPS grew, I think 8%, I can't remember the exact percentages, but their NPS, Net Promoter Score, and membership growth increased during that period to the point where now they're winning with their customers and they have double-digit same-store sales growth for multiple quarters in a row. Quest Diagnostics at their call centers, when they adopted the good job strategy, their transfer rates, right? When you can't answer the customer's question because the rep has been there for 3 months and they don't know what they're talking about, that dropped from 12% to less than 9%. Calls answers within 60 seconds went from 50% to 70%. I can go on and on, but one of the biggest things was Moe's Original Barbecue, a restaurant company. Like what they do is now they serve a lot more customers because now their employees are excited about serving those customers. So you see this in the go-to-market with their customer satisfaction and sales.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. David, did you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. It's a terrific panel. I guess one thing that Zeynep is saying, but also in what Nick was mentioning as well, is that part of what makes these jobs different is you're really sort of broadening the scope of the work that people do, and you're giving them a different level of responsibility. I mean, I think a lot of management philosophy, certainly, going, back to scientific management and so on, is the people, the brains are in the organization, they're not in the person, they need to carry out this repetitive action. And so you're promoting a different model, which actually, I think, maybe managers would find kind of risky, because you're actually having to rely on these employees. They're not interchangeable any longer, and they're kind of a valuable, specialized asset. And that also gives them a lot more bargaining power, by the way, because you can't just say, well, I'll fire you and hire the next person in line.
And their skills are portable.
Exactly. So I wonder how, if that resonates with you, and if that's expressed, and if that's in any way a barrier or an asset.
Yeah, I can't answer on the bargaining side, but on the trusting people side to make decisions, to involve in improvement and making their job, there's employee ownership, but there's also ownership of the work, right? If you go to Costco, the meat manager there, he owns that section, right? He's thinking about how they improve that performance. I asked the same question to the founder of Four Seasons Hotels, because of all the hospitality companies, Four Seasons is one where frontline employees are empowered to do so much for the customer. So I asked him, how can you trust people all the way from Turkey to Costa Rica, so many different places in the world, lowest paid workers in the organization, how can you trust them to make decisions on behalf of your company? And he looked at me and said, have you ever met anyone who doesn't want to succeed? And the thing is, that's his assumption about humans. And he creates an organization and he creates practices that makes assumption true, right? And if the assumption is people are not reliable, we can't trust them, then of course we create a context that makes that true as well. So Mercadona is a Spanish company, to bring it back to Spain. Their first principle is everyone is reliable.
Yeah.
Maybe just a last thought, when I think you already know this, David, but just one of the other barriers we see to like getting people to feel like they can maybe they build some skills that are portable. So I'm thinking in terms of benefiting the worker and not the company here, is that there's no like coherent, cohesive system of acknowledging certificates, trainings, and saying, okay, I've built up these micro trainings, and they add up to something that is a valid course that everyone understands, that's truly portable. So even though skills generally are portable, it's hard to demonstrate that portability to people to incentivize them to skill up. So I think there's also another blocker of just a cohesive certificate system that we don't have in America. That's not a university degree.
Well, excellent. I think that's all the time we have. Please join me in thanking our panelists.